Hello, this is the Ignite Your Leadership Prowess podcast. And today with me, I've got Carolyn Herfurth. She's the co-founder, Impostor Syndrome Institute. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for coming on the show.
I always love an invitation like this to talk about imposter syndrome.
Lovely, lovely. I know you're an expert when we talk about imposter syndrome, which is why we've got you here. I'm so delighted you come. So we're just going to dive straight into it because I know working with a lot of female leaders, women, men, so many people, imposter syndrome is a huge debate. Could you please say something about what imposter syndrome is and what it is not?
It's a great question, Muti. I'm going to start with what it's not. It is not a fancy word for low self-esteem. Think about self-esteem as a global or universal sense we have about ourselves, where imposter syndrome is specific to achievement arenas, work, school, business, career. And so if you're emptying the dishwasher or power shopping online, you're not going to feel that sense of imposter syndrome. But if you are in a new situation as an entrepreneur and you haven't done it before, or you're in a meeting and you have to make a presentation, you might experience imposter syndrome in those situations.
Okay, so we've talked about.
But actually, I should go on because now let me talk about I talked about what it's not.
Yeah.
Low self-esteem. So what it is first of all, imposter phenomenon is a term that was coined in 1978 by two psychologists, Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes. And the term imposter syndrome came along a few years after that. And that's more of a popular culture term for imposter syndrome. But what it means, but it's not a diagnosis of any sort. So what it is imposter syndrome is a belief that millions of people worldwide, and the fact that you and I are in different countries having this conversation is proof of that. Millions and millions of people worldwide, both men and women, or people who however people identify, it's this belief that they have that they are not as talented, intelligent, capable, or qualified as other people think they are. And the fascinating thing about it is that these feelings exist despite evidence to the contrary. So you graduated from uni, you started a business, you have business growth, or you got a promotion. So those things exist, yet we still feel like we're imposters. So if you can see the diploma on the wall, if you can, read the LinkedIn recommendations that people write about you, if you can, hear the positive performance review or hear the customer raves, then what's going on? Well, the thing is, people who experience imposter syndrome are very good at explaining away our success and coming up with excuses and very valid, rational sounding reasons for why we're really not as successful as everybody out there thinks we are.
Oh, okay, so where exactly does it come from?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm sure you'll eventually get to the question, what do we do about it? And so I'm actually going to I'll give you a little spoiler alert here. One of the three tools that we recommend to address imposter syndrome is to normalize it. That's the first tool, normalize it. And one way of normalizing it is to understand where it comes from. What are the different sources? So you can contextualize it more and personalize it less. And so some of the sources, it might be family messaging. Like, what kind of messages did you get growing up? It could be around grades where, one family is like, you come home with 4 A's and 1 B, and your family's like, what's that B doing there? So that might be the message in one family, and another family might not even acknowledge all A's. And so what's going on there? So it just might be messages around, and expectations of you as a kid. So there are a lot of things like we could go super, super deep into that, but in general, just that's one of the sources. Another source, I just want to make sure I still have, okay, I still have you. Another one is the well-documented confidence gap between people who identify as female and people who identify as male. And there have been studies done, and one is a study that was with 10,000 people, over half outside of the US, where they showed that females have a much lower confidence level in their 20s and 30s than men. It increases a little bit in their 40s and 50s, and by 60s, women are more confident than men. But those are career platform building years, and so that confidence gap can really impact a woman's growth, a female's career growth and financial growth, so, and business growth. So whatever, context that they're in. So, you've got family messages and expectations, the confidence gap. There's also not feeling a sense of belonging. If you work or study in a different culture, that can create feelings of being an other and not feeling a sense of belonging, which might stir up these imposter feelings. So my co-founder of Impostor Syndrome Institute, her name is Dr. Valerie Young. She wrote the book on imposter syndrome. It's called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. And one of the things she has delivered a talk that she created called Rethinking Imposter Syndrome. It's a solution that our organization, Impostor Syndrome Institute, is all about, teaching speakers how to deliver it, teaching coaches how to coach to it. So this Rethinking Imposter Syndrome solution she's delivered it to over 100 universities. And she said, every time I do it, the majority of people who show up at those talks are the international students, because they're like working in a different culture, often in a different language. So think about it. They have the same stress as every other college kid. Every other kid who's going to university, you're being tested every single day about how smart you are. But then you have to do it in another culture and often in another language. And so that feeling as an other or not belonging that's just one example of that. So, and there's so much more about it. There's a huge, there's a lot of intersection between diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity and inclusion, and imposter syndrome. So I could give you a lot more examples. I'll just leave it with that one. And there are also situational factors. If you're this work from home or during COVID and the pandemic and people having to work from home, they didn't have the water cooler talk. They didn't have, that was a situational factor where people all of a sudden became siloed and soloed. And so that's an example, situational factors like that can come up that might create that sense of having imposter feelings. So there are field specific, there are industry and culture, in sectors where the culture can fuel self-doubt. And really what it all comes down to, if there was one core source to answer your question in a nutshell, it would be shame. So it's any of these things that lead to that path of shame.
Wow, that's so powerful. My goodness, so powerful. Thank you. So how does it work itself? How does it work, within us?
Yeah, well, according to my co-founder, Dr. Valerie Young, she is regarded as the world's foremost expert on this topic. And what she has learned and studied, she's been working on this for 4 decades. People with imposter syndrome have a distorted definition of competence, but we don't all distort it the same way. So she, over the years, started to notice that there are different people, the different ways people identify with competence, she started to be able to put them into buckets or categories. She calls them the 5 competence types. And so there's a person who identifies as a perfectionist. cares about how things are done. If it's not 100% perfect, not good enough. 99 out of 100, not good enough. So they're the perfectionists out there. You're nodding your head like, I might be a perfectionist. And a lot of people identify with perfectionism. Another type of is the expert. This is not about how you do things as much as what you know and how much you know. A third type is the soloist. That's who completes the task. I have to do everything myself. In order to be considered competent, I have to do it myself. And so they're rarely going to ask for coaching or help. It's just like, I got to slug it out on my own. This next one is one that I identify with. It's the natural genius. And so I expect everything to come naturally. Where for me, competence is measured on ease and speed. So I'm not afraid to do new things, but if I don't have it figured out and like jump into something new and can't get it right the first time, just quickly and easily, then I feel like I am not as competent. So there's that natural genius mindset. And then the fifth type is how many roles can you juggle? And so it's like, it's the perfectionist on steroids. So it's, you not only have to like crush it at work, you have to be the perfect partner. You have to be the perfect parent. You have to like cook gourmet meals and maintain a hot, rock hard body, So there's that superhuman out there too. Now you really shook your head. So do you think you're maybe a superhuman?
Oh my goodness. When you said that, I was like, oh my goodness, just want to be everywhere. I'm almost try to be the best everywhere. And I know that's got its disadvantages as well.
Yeah.
Everything, want to be everywhere, do everything. Like, yes, I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. And when you say the superwoman, my husband actually says, you think you're a superwoman? Come on, take a break, that sort of thing. Yeah.
I love that. The thing is too, Muti, is that these feelings that you have about having to do everything perfectly, those lead to behaviors. Those feelings lead to behaviors. And the behaviors associated with imposter syndrome have costs and consequences. And it sounds like your audience is primarily entrepreneurs. But if someone listening to this is building a business where they're gonna have more employees or works for an organization, those costs and consequences don't just impact you as an individual, it also impacts your organization. And what happens is we end up developing coping mechanisms. And so what we do is we start trying to cope with the anxiety of waiting to be found out and actually avoid being found out. So, one coping mechanism, there are many, but there's some primary ones. One might be flying under the radar. So putting it in the context of entrepreneurs, an entrepreneur might be like, well, I'm not going to start posting on Instagram, or I'm not going to start doing TikTok videos, or I'm not going to do LinkedIn until I have, 10 things in the can, or until I know it's perfect, and I'm going to study everybody else's TikToks before I start getting myself out there. So they might fly under the radar from a marketing and visibility perspective. In corporate, it might be don't raise their hand in meetings, because they don't want to be found out as being incompetent. So that might be one way you cope about it. Another one, which boy, can I identify this one, procrastinating on important projects or tasks. For me, it always showed up. I'm so much better. I'm so much more aware, and I have the tools to do something about it. But I can think back 10 years ago, it was a consistent thing where I would procrastinate. Like I'd, invest $10,000 or $15,000 to go to some speaker training, and they wanted us to prepare for it. And I would wait until the last minute to actually do my prep, because then if I showed up and it wasn't ready, I'd have the built-in excuse, well, I really didn't, I didn't do my, I didn't put my best effort into this. And so it was a way for me to kind of explain away why I wasn't doing as well as I could have, or didn't do as well. So those, those are a couple of examples that are how you can start noticing the way it shows up.
Wow, wow, that's really great insight. Thank you so much. People beginning to like saying, oh, this is who I am. This is who I am, identifying how they, identify with imposter syndrome. So now that we know that, how can imposter syndrome be overcome?
Well, one of the things I'm going to say is, and Valerie would say this as well, you don't really overcome it forever. Okay. There's not a cure. And the reason I say that is because some people might think, oh, well, the more successful you become, the less you feel it. Well, actually, the opposite is true. The more successful you become, the more you feel it. Is you feel more like, oh my gosh, am I really worthy? Am I just struggling? They still might be struggling. So what we do when you talk overcome, that probably is a better term for it, because it's something. It's an awareness, right? So we boil it down to 3 simple, practical, immediately usable tools. And we already talked about one of them, which is to normalize in the context of recognizing the different sources of imposter syndrome, so you can contextualize more and personalize less. And you can also normalize by breaking the silence, like having this conversation today, or, an organization. We do a lot of keynotes and workshops. Having an organization bring us in to do a keynote or workshop to talk about it. So people are like, oh, I'm not the only one who feels this. Oh my gosh, thank goodness. I thought I was the only one. So normalizing it is really the first step. And there's a term that we use at Imposter Syndrome Institute to describe people who don't experience imposter syndrome. So, and they're not arrogant know-it-alls, like smartest guy in the room type of person. It's people who actually don't experience imposter syndrome. Like they have we call them humble realists. And a humble realist has a realistic understanding of what it means to be competent. They think differently. They respond differently to failure and mistakes and constructive criticism. And they think and respond differently to fear. So instead of continuing to think like the perfectionist, the expert, the natural genius, the soloist, the superhuman, our second tool is to reframe our thinking, to understand what competence really means. So we're guiding people to start thinking like a humble realist. So the way you're able to do that, our second tool is reframe, is adopting a healthy understanding of and response to competence and failure and mistakes and constructive criticism and fear. So for example, the perfectionist, instead of like beating themselves up over that one typo or the one time they tripped up in the presentation, they might just be like, okay, that was just a small mistake. I can let it slide, or the expert, instead of responding to a new project or by thinking, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing. Instead, they can think, well, I've never done this before, but I can figure it out. So it's finding new ways to look at and reframe situations that are continually going to keep coming up, right? And then our third tool is that you just need to keep going regardless, which is like such a long name for that tool, but you have to keep going regardless of how confident you feel, knowing that the more you do, the more confident you will feel. So, regardless of those early messages and expectations that we talked about, regardless of maybe not feeling that sense of belonging, being among the few or the only or the first in a situation, regardless of being on the social, on the end of social stereotypes, or the pressure about competence of having to represent your entire group, or regardless of working in a field where people are especially susceptible to feeling like imposters, or being in an organizational culture that fuels self-doubt. So that's, and once you understand these tools, normalize, reframe, and keep going regardless, then it becomes about hitting the pause button when you find yourself having an imposter moment.
That is so epic. Hit the pause button when you find yourself getting into the imposter moment. That is so powerful. Ooh, that's a good one for people to remember. Wow, that's been so great. Thank you so much for all the insights that you shared, Dr. Carolyn Herfurth, and nice having you on the show today. And this is where we're going to be putting a pause button onto the show today. It's the Ignite Your Leadership Prowess podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for watching.